If you know me, you know I loathe the establishment with every fiber of my being. Big tech, big government, big pharma, big banks, all of it. I'm a Jeffersonian through and through. Why? Well, many reasons. But in short, the establishment has one very big thing in common. They're arrogant. When you're arrogant, you're closed-minded. When you're closed-minded, you'll sit at the Holy Office and put on inquisitions against guys who dare to say the world is not at the center of the universe. Big establishment is the enemy of human progress. They have shown this throughout history. They're the enemy of truth, and they're the enemy of humility in the eyes of God. But one of the most egregious places where arrogance tends to obscure truth is in big academia, and in particular, it's in humanities. Think about it. Science evolves. Math theories are adjusted. History gets discovered. But the humanities are almost always the last to change any narrative. It might be a close finish with archaeology, but I digress. One of my favorite examples of this is this raging debate about the identity of William Shakespeare. I love this. The debate is very simple. Big academia insists William Shakespeare was one man, born of humble origins, a mere peasant who happened to know the inner workings and humors of the royal court, who rose to prominence with his singular genius, all while being unable to write his own name, because he was in fact illiterate. The other side say it was an author or collection of authors who were part of Queen Elizabeth's court and inner circle and wrote under a pseudonym. And they have a long list of facts to back them up. Shakespeare's plays were hyper-political. They were ingeniously nuanced. And if you're in this camp of people and believers, you are called an anti-Stratfordian. Here's filmmaker and playwright Phoebe, who's also an Oxfordian researcher. You can find her work on TikTok and YouTube at Phoebe de Vere, breaking down who she believes is really behind the quill.
Our most famous writer lived a life that is shrouded in mystery. In fact, questions about the author's identity have been around as long as the plays themselves. Will was born in the rural village of Stratford-upon-Avon to illiterate parents, but through hard work and innate genius, produced masterpieces such as Hamlet and Macbeth. Or at least that's how the story goes. In fact, some of history's greatest thinkers have been convinced that the man from Stratford-upon-Avon was not actually the writer of Shakespeare's plays. Mark Twain, Sigmund Freud, Walt Whitman, and Vladimir Nabokov are just some of those who believe that William Shakespeare was actually the secret pen name of an Elizabethan nobleman.
Phoebe Neer joins us now. Phoebe, welcome back.
Thank you so much, Chanel. I'm thrilled to be here.
Call me an anti-Stratfordian. I studied this in college, and when I looked at this was long ago, but when I looked at the arguments for the fact that William Shakespeare was a pseudonym for someone else or a group of people, I was sold. What are your reasons for jumping on this wagon?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it sounds like it's a very shocking statement to say that an artist, used a pen name. Shakespeare wasn't Shakespeare. It's this big conspiracy theory. But even, this has kind of been the case to the arts for all of human history. If you look at the top 40 pop charts today, probably the majority of those artists are not using their real name. And this is the case if you look at Homer. The 5 books of Moses are not really written by Moses, the Psalms of David. And so, I'm sure a lot of your viewers know that Marilyn Monroe is a pseudonym. Mark Twain is a pseudonym. Mark Twain, incidentally, big Shakespeare truther, wrote a whole book about it, calling the traditional Stratford biography an Eiffel Tower of artificialities. But, fewer people know that George Orwell is a pseudonym, or even Molière, the kind of most famous French playwright of the 17th century, was an aristocrat who was writing plays under a pseudonym because he didn't want to get in trouble. And the Elizabethan period is the golden age of pseudonyms. There are scholars who've estimated that 70% of writing that was published in this period was written under pseudonyms. William Shakespeare kind of memes 70. And echoes 70. It's crazy. Yeah. I mean, not a lot of people are writing, and a lot of writing that comes out, you have to have a good reason for it. And a lot of it is, political in nature, or secret messages that people are trying to pass. But, in this time period, kind of the most common construction of what pseudonyms would have looked like were things like Adam Foulweather or Simon Smellnave, William Shake-Speare. This kind of hyphen was sort of a wink to people at the time that would have been very obvious. Just like if you see somebody's pseudonym on X today, you know, there's certain things, if you see numbers in it, or if you say, you know, Chanel Rion Enjoyer, that's probably a pseudonym and not somebody's real name on X. So yeah, those are just some of the reasons why I think it's an exciting time to be an anti-Stratfordian.
Well, I think you're a fan of the Edward de Vere theory, right? You think that it's this nobleman who was, so you're a fan of the singular guy saying that he was the writer. He was close to the inner workings and the court intrigues of the Elizabethan culture, and to keep his status there, he wouldn't dare use his own name.
Yeah, well, so it's an interesting story. I loved your intro. That was so anti-establishment. I'm going to pivot a little bit because I want to plug my friend Rima Greenhill's book, because she's a Stanford professor who's an Oxfordian. Sorry, I'm doing a horrible job positioning this to the camera. It's called Shakespeare, Elizabethan, Ivan. And I'm just bringing it up as an example of kind of to contextualize for people what Shakespeare's plays really were like in their time. So this is a little bit of a digression, but maybe people have heard of the term problem plays that are not as popular as, say, Romeo and Juliet or Hamlet. You know, there's more than 30 plays that are signed by William Shakespeare, but we don't see a lot of them because a lot of them are confusing. And one of the reasons why is that these kind of problem plays were actually these very inside baseball kind of SNL style parodies making fun of what was going on in Queen Elizabeth's court, making fun of, in certain cases, like particular noblemen. And so my friend Rima Greenhill's book, Shakespeare, Elizabethan, Ivan, it goes about how Love's Labour's Lost, which is sort of a problem play, you see it very rarely. She discovered that it's actually a SNL-style spoof of the failed marriage negotiation between Tsar Ivan the Terrible and Queen Elizabeth in the 1570s. So this is a time period in which Will of Stratford was like a little boy kind of growing up in Stratford-upon-Avon, and then this play, which people don't really understand. There's these random things that happen. People start speaking in Russian accents, start wearing fur hats out of nowhere. But thanks to Oxfordian scholarship that uses the premise that Edward de Vere wrote the plays and not Will of Stratford, we can finally laugh at what the jokes are and understand that they're these brilliant, pointed political satires.
Yeah, and there was a huge motivation to use a pen name, because if you were deemed an enemy of the Queen, the consequences were pretty steep.
Absolutely. Yeah. We have a very rosy perception of, the golden era of English theater, but in fact, people were getting their hands cut off. People were getting their heads cut off. There was this thing that was illegal called, it was a law against application. And what application was if you would take kind of a historical story, let's say a story set in ancient Rome, like the story of Julius Caesar, and you would apply it to the current political context. And people were doing this all the time. In fact, a lot of the reason why people were going to the theater so obsessively, and why there was such a buzz around the theater, was that this was the only place where you could really get your news. You know, Queen Elizabeth has been on the throne for 40 years. She's very old. No one knows who the next heir to the throne is going to be. And you're not allowed to ask who's the next king. You're not allowed to ask this. And so people are desperate to try and get any information and communicate with one another. And theater and the stage becomes a primary flashpoint where they can communicate, oftentimes through, oh, this is a story set in Italy. This is a story set in, ancient Athens. So, I think there's a lot more excitement. It's a lot more visceral than I think people are taught in classrooms today. And that's part of what excites me about it. Is, for me, I love learning about the plays in their historical context. And I hope that young people today will start to realize, oh, it's not just kind of this boring thing where it was some proto-Hollywood. No. This is like KGB. I mean, people are really putting their lives on the line to speak the truth.
Speaking of, people putting their lives on the line to find the truth, some famous, believers in this alternative theory, this counterfactual, if you will, went on to found, say, the NSA, right? There's some very interesting and very brainy people have been drawn to this narrative. And when they look into the story of William Shakespeare, so many things don't add up. And when you look at the people who have sided with this theory, like, hey, it might be Edward de Vere, it might be, Francis Bacon, it might be someone else, their explanations are far more plausible than any single defense that William Shakespeare was one guy, William Shakespeare, a peasant in the English countryside.
100%. So I'll try to give a very brief summary of the history of the Shakespeare authorship question. So in like the 1850s, it was actually a huge amount of momentum in amongst public thought leaders, where people thought it was almost like a hoax or a joke. The famous writer Henry James,
right.
He calls the myth of the divine will the greatest fraud ever practiced on a patient world. People just felt like they kind of sensed that Will of Stratford was illiterate. It didn't really make any sense why this kind of goofy guy was somehow writing these plays, almost all of which are set in aristocratic courts. And so there was kind of this massive movement, like a manhunt. People were like, okay, it can't be this traditional narrative, which just smells crazy. Who wrote it? And so they put out all these names, from Queen Elizabeth to Francis Bacon, who happens to be cousins with Edward de Vere by marriage, all these different noblemen,
right.
because people were kind of like, it has to be a nobleman. And so they were kind of putting all these names forward. The problem is Edward de Vere was so thoroughly canceled for his kind of politically subversive writing in his own time. He was in some cases literally physically erased from the historical record, that at this very exciting period where there's a lot of momentum behind the Shakespeare authorship inquiry, his name doesn't even get thrown into the ring because he's so lost and buried. And so what happens is Francis Bacon kind of develops the momentum. You mentioned the NSA. It's crazy, but it's true that there were these librarians that were working full time trying to crack the Baconian ciphers. They were looking through Shakespeare's plays, hoping to find evidence in code that Francis Bacon had written these plays, and they're really going at it, and they're good at what they're doing, so that the U.S. government takes notice. They get enlisted, and they end up decoding Purple, which is Japan's version of the Enigma code. The problem is, and again, these are the brightest minds, and they were able to win World War II, but they weren't able to crack the Baconian ciphers. And so the public starts to kind of feel like this whole thing's a red herring. They're losing interest, and they think, all right, maybe it's just the Stratford guy, whatever, who cares? We haven't solved the case. And it's unfortunate that at this moment, J.T. Loney in 1920, who's an obscure school teacher in England, he's like, I'm going to look at every single person and make it like almost like a Sherlock Holmes style mystery. I'm going to find every single person who was on this crime scene, and I'm going to figure out who wrote these plays. And so that's how he writes his landmark book in 1920, Shakespeare identified as Edward de Vere. But the kind of sad story is, by this point, it was almost like A Boy Who Cried Wolf. However, he did get buy-in. Sigmund Freud was a big fan. I think James Joyce probably cryptically seems to allude to it in Ulysses, Nabokov, and he has his followers. But think about how kind of locked in by 1920 the humanities are on professional college campuses. It's like nobody wants to hear that they've been teaching the wrong guy their whole career. And so, at that point, it's really marginalized. And so, but I think that there's a lot of momentum today. And I'm hoping that with the internet and people like you and independent media, that Edward de Vere and the work of kind of independent scholars like J.T. Loney and so many of my heroes starts to rise up.
This seems like such an obscure conversation, but it's actually so relevant to, again, going back to this discussion about the establishment versus the non-establishment. And the non-establishment for so long has been pushed off into this category of saying, you guys are fringe theorists, you have no idea what you're talking about. We, the elites, have all the knowledge, all the wisdom, and the truths written in stone. And the point I made earlier, though, is while you find that in just about every category of life, period, the humanities and academia seems to me like the worst offenders. I would say there might be a close photo finish for archaeology, because you also have these archaeologists who have worked for decades on theories and then they've refused to let it go. But it seems humanities is the worst offender. Why?
I think the humanities, reality isn't punching you as hard in the face as in certain areas of STEM. I think people, only really weird nerds get involved in the academic humanities by and large, and people I don't think feel that it impacts their lives as much as like if technology or medicines don't work. We live in a very interesting moment, and I think this kind of crisis in authority in academia and the expert class is pervasive. I don't know. I kind of like to think sometimes about, are your viewers familiar with Let's Go Brandon, the meme Let's Go Brandon? Is that too much of a long walk? So
Yeah,
I think of
we all know let's go Brandon.
I think of William Shakespeare as kind of the let's go Brandon of the Elizabethan period, which is to say that, you see him kind of vaunted and held up. There's this like kind of Disney World thing in his hometown, but the equivalent is it's basically like a meme. People are today who are saying that he wrote it, they're on the outside of the inside joke. They're the ones that are saying, oh yeah, Brandon's the race car driver. Should I give some context on what that meme is for
Right.
people? I kind of dove right into that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically,
Right.
the
No,
meme of
and
let's
then
go-
decades from now, I mean, if we don't keep up or explain that story, people will lose the context. And yeah, there will be a surface level explanation for it, but it completely misses the joke. All right, Phoebe,
Exactly. So
we're
for
out
any
of
of these
time.
mainstream- oh, yeah,
I
sorry.
love this topic, and I love following your stuff. Tell people how they can find your work.
Yeah, I am posting on YouTube and on TikTok. My handle is Phoebe_de Vere. And yeah, there's exciting stuff coming to light all the time. I do interviews with scholars and post some of my own research. So I hope you will get involved and learn more.
I love it. Phoebe Neer, Oxfordian researcher. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Chanel.
Don't go anywhere. Next up, we have an interview with the great Kash Patel up next.